A helicopter crash near Magic Mountain today brought tragedy to the set of the Steven Spielberg movie, The Twilight Zone. Actor Vic Morrow and two small children were killed when the chopper came down as they were shooting a war scene.
On the evening of July 23, 1982, Vic Morrow, a decorated veteran television and film actor best known for roles in Blackboard Jungle and The Bad News Bears, showed up to a movie ranch in Valencia, California to film a scene for The Twilight Zone, the movie. The film was a highly anticipated anthology based on Rod Serling's classic television series, featuring 4 different stories directed by some of the biggest names in Hollywood like Steven Spielberg, Joe Dante, and George Miller. Morrow's installment was directed by John Landis, already a legendary comedy director for his work on Kentucky Fried Movie, National Lampoon's Animal House, The Blues Brothers, and An American Werewolf in London. The scene called for Morrow's character, an avowed racist named Bill Connor, to be taken back in time and placed in various situations where the tables would be turned and he would suffer as a persecuted victim. It was a classic Twilight Zone conceit, teaching a lesson to an unlikable character through a strange science fiction-tinged plot steeped in irony that would thrust Morrow's character into various circumstances, including being a Jewish man in Vichy France around the time of World War II, a black man about to be lynched by the Ku Klux Klan, and, for this particular scene, a Vietnamese man rescuing 2 young children about to be killed by American soldiers during the Vietnam War. Although primarily known for his comedies, John Landis wasn't entirely unfamiliar with filming large action set pieces, as with some of the chase sequences in Blues Brothers. But this scene amped things up to another level entirely, featuring 2 young child actors, a helicopter hovering about 25 feet off the ground, and a series of expensive pyrotechnic effects to heighten the drama and suspense. The 2 actors, 7-year-old Myca Dinh and 6-year-old Renee Shin-Yi Chen, were hired after Renee's uncle was approached by a colleague whose wife worked as a production secretary for the movie. The location for the night shoot was chosen because it featured a vast 600-acre expanse with diverse topography, including dense jungle-like riverbeds that made it an ideal place to stand in for the Vietnamese landscape. It was also far enough from the city lights to mimic the rural farming villages in Southeast Asia. The scene involved Morrow's character carrying the 2 children out of a deserted village and across a shallow river while being pursued by American soldiers hovering in a helicopter. The helicopter, a utility military helicopter called a Bell UH-1B Iroquois, was piloted by an actual Vietnam War veteran named Dorsey Wingo, who skillfully hovered the craft and turned it in mid-air to accomplish various camera shots. Complicating matters were a series of mortars set to detonate at various points during the scene to mimic the explosions common in Vietnam War films. One of the mortars was positioned underneath the tail rotor of the helicopter. The tail rotor is a critical piece of equipment for maintaining stability while the helicopter hovers, essentially providing counter-rotational force to offset the spinning of the main rotors. While filming the action sequence, a mortar directly beneath the tail rotor of the helicopter exploded, which eventually caused the tail rotor to fail and detach completely from the tail. And without the tail rotor, the low-flying helicopter spun out of control. At the same time, Morrow dropped Renee in the water and was reaching out to grab her when the helicopter crashed to the ground. Morrow and Lee were decapitated by the helicopter's main rotor blades, while Renee was crushed to death by the craft's right landing skid. All 3 died almost instantly. Vic Morrow was 53 years old. I'm Derek Kaufman.
I'm Jason Beckerman.
And this is Last Days, the Twilight Zone tragedy.
The tragic accident on set triggered a series of investigations, starting with the National Transportation Safety Board issuing a comprehensive report a couple years later in October 1984 with the following findings. First, the NTSB determined that the probable cause of the accident was the detonation of debris-laden high-temperature explosives too near a low-flying helicopter, leading to foreign object damage to 1 rotor blade. The explanation at the time was that a metal lid on the mortar directly beneath the tail rotor shot upwards and damaged the spinning blades, causing it to fail. Second, the heat from the mortar explosion caused the rotor blades to delaminate, weakening the layers and causing them to separate from the rotor assembly. The failure of the rotor blades caused the uncontrollable descent and eventual crash of the helicopter. And third, the NTSB found that the proximity of the helicopter to the special effects explosion was due to communication errors and failures between the pilot, Dorsey Wingo, and the film director, John Landis.
I want to point out that there is footage of this online because this was obviously a very expensive scene to shoot, and they were recording when it happened.
Trying to get this one take, right? Each take costs a fortune.
Yes, and it happens very, very quickly. You do see him in the water, and then you see the helicopter crash on top of them. It's not particularly gory because it all happens so quickly, but what happened is pretty clear. I mean, this is very technical. That mortar had like a paint lid can. It was like a paint can with a lid on top, and that lid jumped up and caused a sequence of things to start failing. The rotor blade falls off. Once the rotor, which is stabilizing this helicopter, falls off, now you have that spinning where the tail of the helicopter is spinning around, and it lost control, and it was only 25 feet off the ground to begin with, so there's no way for the people on the ground to escape. It was really a very technical scene, extremely dangerous, hard to imagine ever filming something like this with real actors in today's day.
Yeah, and as we're going to see in a minute, it came at a hefty toll for all the people, obviously the deceased and injured, but for the film directors as well. As is typical in such cases, the NTSB findings about the causes of the accident ended up pointing fingers at certain parties, which led to criminal and civil actions to hold these parties responsible for the tragedy. Director John Landis, production manager Dan Allingham, associate producer George Folsey, helicopter pilot Dorsey Wingo, and explosive specialist Paul Stewart were all charged with manslaughter in what turned out to be a 9-month criminal trial spanning 1986 and 87. It marked the first time that a director was charged due to the fatality on set.
The criminal trials featured explosive testimony from various crew members, as well as testimony from the family members of the victims. The father of 7-year-old Myca Lee testified that he heard Landis instructing the helicopter pilot to fly lower. This was consistent with testimony from a cameraman that recounted a tense exchange between the production manager wanting to get the helicopter away from the explosives, while Landis shouted over the radio, "Get lower," several times. Another camera operator testified that Landis had shrugged off warnings about the stunt with the comment, "We may lose the helicopter." Even though the camera operator acknowledged this may have been a joke at the time, it was clear that the prosecutors were painting Landis as a strong-willed director unwilling to take safety measures seriously enough on the set. The helicopter pilot, Dorsey Wingo, also testified that there were approximately 5 seconds between the time that the sound of the helicopter changed, indicating a loss of control, and the actual impact with the ground. Wingo expressed regret that Morrow had not looked up, which may have given him a chance to escape the danger, but he's quick to clarify that he was not placing blame on Morrow for the tragedy. On cross-examination, however, prosecutors reminded Wingo that Morrow was carrying the 2 children in his arms while standing in knee-deep water, so it's not clear he could have gotten out of harm's way even if he had looked up. And Deputy District Attorney Lee D'Agostino harshly criticized Wingo's testimony, calling it, quote, "a classic example of a defense. They're blaming the parents. They're blaming the fire safety officers. They're out here blaming everyone. Now they're blaming the dead man. It's incredible." Years later, Wingo would talk about the tragedy and still seemed to place the bulk of the blame on Landis and others.
You know, there was a blinding flash of the explosions alternating with the solid blackness of the night, which is either illuminated by the fireball or was blackness, and we were spinning as many as 5 or 6 rotations before we came back to the earth.
And there was no way to get in contact with them. They were coming across the river when
I had no idea as a pilot exactly where we were because of the violent turns in the aircraft.
How many turns did it make?
The specialist that took the footage and did a frame-by-frame count estimated 5 to 6 turns, complete 360s.
So you were just out of control.
And after a long and bitterly divisive trial, all 5 men were acquitted of the manslaughter charges.
There's such a temptation to hold people accountable. You want to place blame on people, and it seems like there was evidence that, at the very least, John Landis, an incredibly well-respected director, great work both before this tragedy and certainly since.
But known as prickly,
known as difficult. He wanted to get the shot. But
of course he wanted to get the shot. It was expensive, and he knew he had to frame this in such a way to look like the Vietnam War, so it was inherently going to be a risky stunt.
But here's the thing, right? Had nobody been hurt, I don't think anybody would have said, boy, we got away with that. They wouldn't. The danger, do you think people there saw the danger, or the danger is just visible in hindsight?
Yes.
I mean, an accident happened, so therefore there was something that went wrong, but I don't think we can just look back and say, well, because somebody got hurt, something must have gone wrong, therefore somebody needs to be held criminally accountable. This is not a civil trial. This is a criminal trial. People are going to go to jail. It's you can't always find liability.
It's hard not to think about rust, right?
Yes.
I mean, you and I discussed that endlessly with the Alec Baldwin trial, the tragic shooting of the cinematographer. But in hindsight, everything looks terrible. He wasn't paying attention to safety meetings. He was on the phone with his family. You know, they were doing target practice on the set. But you're 100% right. Everyone thought their set was filled with blanks and there was no harm that could be done. And when he pointed that gun at Helena Hutchins, he was trying to block for a scene and they were trying to get a shot. Of course, he didn't intend to harm anyone. Yeah. But prosecutors do a really good job of painting a reckless sort of picture.
Yeah. Let me see if I can articulate the difference between Rust and Twilight Zone. In Rust, a bullet came out of that gun. So even if you're on set and a bullet flies out of the gun, and let's say it doesn't hit anybody, right? It just flies into a wall. It's an oh shit moment. Like something went really wrong. Here, if the helicopter, doesn't start to disassemble and come apart and there isn't this accident, there's no reason to think that it was dangerous at all, right? The tragedy happened because things broke.
Yes.
In Rust, the tragedy happened because somebody screwed up and put the bullet in the gun. Maybe it's a distinction without a difference. I'm sure the families of the deceased are not, happy with that, but that's the way it happened.
Yeah, I mean, I take your point. It's an inherently dangerous stunt in the first place. You have mortars going off, pyrotechnics, something can go wrong, and a sequence of tragic events just unfolded, and unfortunately 3 lives were lost that day.
So that was the criminal trial. There were also civil suits. The parents of Lee and Chen settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. Morrow's daughter, Carrie Ann Morrow, and Jennifer Jason Lee, who had been estranged from her father, also ended up suing and settling the case for an undisclosed amount. The lawsuits involving Lee and Chen were complicated by the fact that both children were being paid under the table to circumvent state law, which prohibited children from working at night. Landis opted not to seek a special waiver for the children, presumably because he believed it would be very difficult to obtain authorization for children to shoot at night for a scene with so many pyrotechnics and helicopter stunts, which is exactly why they have these licensing requirements, because you don't want children in harm's way. Associate producer George Folsey even told the children's parents not to tell any firefighters on the set that the children were part of the scene at all. Throughout the years of litigation, John Landis came off as aloof, pretentious, and unfeeling towards the victims, almost like the accident had been an annoyance in his life. Whether this attitude was real or just an unfair perception generated by the media, it undoubtedly had an impact on his reputation and almost certainly improved the settlement leverage for the families. As time went on, settling for large sums of money with the family seemed to be the only way for people to move on with their lives and careers. Speaking about the tragedy in 1996, Landis would say, quote, "There was absolutely no good aspect about this whole story. The tragedy, which I think about every day, had an enormous impact on my career, from which I may possibly never recover." Steven Spielberg, a co-producer on the Twilight Zone movie, broke off his friendship with Landis following the accident, saying the crash left everyone who worked on the movie, quote, "sick to the center of our souls." Spielberg would say, quote, "No movie is worth dying for. I think people are standing up much more now than ever before to producers and directors who ask too much. If something isn't safe, it's the right and responsibility of every actor or crew member to yell, 'cut.'" It's so interesting to hear him say that. He is taking a direct shot at Landis because he knows that there's inherent dangers. Tragedies might happen, but what he's saying is Landis was callous. He didn't care. He went forward. It's pretty remarkable stuff.
It is. And to be fair, Landis was sort of his worst enemy. Even if you listen to that quote, he says he thinks about the tragedy every day and the enormous impact it had on his career.
Yeah.
So his concern was how this derailed what was a very promising career. There's a lot of statements like this by John Landis over the years. He's a prickly fella. And I think the combination of a tragic incident and his sort of personality quirks really harmed him.
Is a hell of a quote.
It's a hell of a quote.
Yeah. You should never mention out loud the impact of that tragedy on your career unless you've preceded it with about 10 lines of how terrible it was for the victims and their families.
Of course.
And in addition, it killed my career, but that means nothing compared to what was lost.
That's a much better statement. It's got to go through your PR because it's a very human way of thinking about it. Of course he was worried about his career, but you're right. You got to send that through some PR. In the aftermath of the tragedy, several organizations and governmental agencies introduced sweeping reforms to ensure better safety on film sets. First, the Federal Aviation Administration instituted regulations to define how helicopters and other aircraft could be operated during film and television productions, including requiring certain certificates before filming such scenes. Second, the Office of the State Fire Marshal in California started its own motion picture and entertainment safety program, specifically focused on fire safety on sets using pyrotechnics. Third, the Screen Actors Guild worked with studios like Warner Brothers to set up dedicated safety committees to establish industry standards for every aspect of filmmaking, from gunfire to fixed-wing aircraft to smoke and pyrotechnics. The standards are now issued and regularly updated as the Injury and Illness Prevention Program Safety Manual for Television and Feature Productions. The IIIP manual, as it's called, is basically an outline of the best practices distributed to production staff to ensure a safe working environment. And fourth, the Directors Guild of America also began publishing regular safety bulletins and created a hotline for directors to, quote, get quick answers to safety questions. The hotline provided a real-time resource for directors dealing with tight deadlines and expensive pre-production for action set pieces, and the measures did improve safety. Filming accidents fell by around 70% between 1982 and 1986, although there were still 6 deaths on sets.
Vic Morrow has become a bit of a footnote in Hollywood history. Losing his life in perhaps the most tragic on-set accident in the history of cinema has obscured the film's accomplishments and reduced him to essentially the answer to a trivia question for younger generations. And that's a real shame, because he was one of the most vibrant on-screen talents of his generation. Born in 1929 in the Bronx, Morrow initially attracted attention playing Stanley Kowalski in a touring production of a Tennessee Williams play, A Streetcar Named Desire. Film buffs may remember the smoldering Marlon Brando performance many years later, but it was Vic Morrow who first captivated audiences with his portrayal of the complicated masculine character. He then scored a memorable role in the 1955 movie Blackboard Jungle as a delinquent student tormenting a teacher played by Glenn Ford.
Easy, Teach. Easy. You could have got hurt over there just now. What happened anyway?
Where'd you come from?
I was just strolling down the street and I saw some guy who threw a bottle right at you, and I figured they were out to get you like last time. You know, you could have been maybe shot or something.
Yeah, something. That Balatzi with those kids?
Balatzi, you mean from our class?
That's right. Wearing the same kind of jacket. They're all wearing the same kind of jacket you are. You're members of the same gang, aren't you?
No, it's a club, Teach. It's a club I belong to, and I didn't see any Balatzi.
Well, you didn't see those kids steal that newspaper truck there either,
That's
did
right.
you? You're just passing by, kind of.
That's right. Just like I said, I was just strolling by. I mean, why should I lie to you?
The movie was a minor sensation at the time and launched Morrow's career. He took bits out of James Dean's playbook from Rebel Without a Cause, but played the role in a grittier, more realistic manner. Morrow became particularly adept at playing tough guys with depth, often men hardened by a dark past or combat time in a war. He starred in the lead role of Sergeant Chip Saunders in ABC's Combat, a World War II drama that aired from 1962 to 1967 and followed the travails of a D-Day squadron. Morrow even branched out to directing the series, including one of its most famous episodes entitled Hills Are for Heroes.
What were you thinking, that you could give me a hand? All I have to do is sit tight and send my troops out to take a couple of bunkers
That can't be taken.
I don't know, Saunders. Go into back inside. Get off your feet. There's nothing you can do here.
You sure, Lieutenant?
I'm sure. It's all mine. And I'll take care of it.
I never doubted it.
Morrow's friend and fellow actor called the episode, quote, one of the greatest anti-war films I've ever seen.
But for a baseball-obsessed kid like me, and I think Jason falls in this category as well, it was Morrow's role as Roy Turner, the villainous coach of the rival Yankees Little League team in the Bad News Bears, that left the most lasting impression.
This is the kid that got the double off you last time, right?
Yeah.
Well, you almost whacked that right out of ballpark, so don't give him anything to hit at. Blowing outside. You gotta just pitch blowing outside. Blowing outside.
Dad, I wanted to strike him out.
All right, play ball.
Go, Engelberg! All right. Get the next one in center. Boy, that was close to my head.
Time!
Just on the rules.
You tried to hit him, didn't you?
No, just gotta wait.
Don't let me!
Morrow easily could have played this role in a sort of broad, slapsticky kind of way, but the audience would have never responded as strongly to the character. You walk away absolutely hating this guy and rooting for the foul-mouthed, lovable losers on the Bears as a result. Walter Matthau and Tatum O'Neal are the stars of the movie, no doubt, but Morrow is the secret ingredient to me that makes it all work, because you've seen this movie. Every baseball fan has seen this movie. There's a scene where his son is a pitcher on the mound, and he, I think, intentionally hits another player. And the anger with which he runs out on the field and excoriates his son, and I think even abuses him. I think slaps him across the face in front of the stunned audience of parents watching a children's baseball game, really hits you home, because it's hard to root for the Bears. They're kind of like miscreants in their own way.
Walter Matthau,
so they make him so bad.
Walter Matthau is a drunk who mistreats his own players, not physically, but like excoriates them, screams at them, belittles them. And you got to root for him.
Yes.
The only way to do that is to have a more villainous character on the other side, and that's Vic Morrow.
And it's perfection. The tragedy on the set of The Twilight Zone had a profound and lasting effect on John Landis. His career was never really the same in the aftermath, although he did continue to make classic comedies such as Spies Like Us, Three Amigos, and Coming to America in the years after the incident. But the carefree innocence of his early years, when he was making movies with John Belushi before Belushi's death in the early 80s, was forever gone, and he's always seemed defiant, annoyed, and even condescending whenever asked about what happened that night in Valencia. It's clear that witnessing such a horrific event has shaken him, but the 6-year legal ordeal that unfolded in its aftermath has seemingly hardened him, and certainly changed the way he's perceived in Hollywood and beyond. Some of this criticism is entirely fair, as Landis has been given multiple opportunities to express his regrets, or at least heartfelt condolences to the families of the victims. Instead, he's remained intent on reframing the tragedy as fodder for an insatiable media driven by scandal-mongering and greed. Still, regardless of your feelings on Landis, it feels only fair to give him the final word.
If you're ever in a serious car accident, have you ever been in any situation where people are killed, whether it's a car accident or train accident or military encounter or something, of course it stays with you. And you learn a lot about fate and a lot about accidents. And that was what's very hard in The Twilight Zone, is to try not to become too cynical or bitter about, because so many people are happy to exploit tragedy. And you learn bitter lessons. I mean, you learn that people want to believe bad things, that it's more fun to believe that evil people went off and did this bad thing than there was an accident.